The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 14 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Each week, we sit down with an historian to discuss their unique insights into our early American past so we can learn more about who we are and how we can affect a better future. Okay, it's trivia time. It's a yes or no answer, so don't panic. Did you know that Russian activities in North America caused the Spanish to colonize California? It's okay if you don't know the answer to that question. And why would most of us know the answer to that question? Because when we think about North American history between the 1760s and 1770s, our minds are preconditioned to take us to the Atlantic seaboard, where inhabitants in 13 colonies waged a revolution and war for independence against Great Britain. But what we forget or tend not to realize is that as that revolution and war raged, Native American and European peoples throughout the rest of the North American continent continued to go about their lives and business. Claudio Sant, the Richard B. Russell Professor of History at the University of Georgia, joins us to explore the events that took place in North America west of the American Revolution. In today's episode, Claudio will reveal the problems colonists and Native Americans experienced when the French, Spanish, and British divided the North American continent in the Treaty of Paris, 1763. Details about the North American fur trade and how activities in Hudson Bay, Canada, and along the Pacific coast brought Europeans and Native American peoples into contact with one another, and how Russian activities in North America affected the colonization of California by the Spanish. Now, I have to say, I'm really excited about this episode because I think it will allow you to make connections that I didn't even realize until I went for my first year of graduate school at the University of California, Davis. I grew up in New England, and I attended college at Penn State. As both a child and as an undergraduate student, my lessons about the early American past started in 1492 with Christopher Columbus, and in the case of Penn State, it jumped to 1607 with the history of Jamestown, Virginia. And in the case of my earlier education in New England, it jumped right to 1620 when the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, Massachusetts. So you can imagine my surprise when I show up for my first year of graduate school and I find myself in early American history courses that begin with Columbus and then they don't jump to the 1600s. Instead, they follow Hernán Cortés's conquest of Mexico and various other Spanish explorers around the southwest of the present-day United States. Now, I had learned about this earlier Spanish colonial history prior to being a graduate student, but I had learned it in a Latin American history class, and one that really focused on the history of South America. So because of my East Coast education that focused on the Atlantic seaboard, I never really connected the history of the American West with the history of the 13 British colonies. And today, Claudio Sant is going to help us all make those connections and realizations. So without further ado, here's our conversation with Claudio Sant.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Today, we welcome Claudio Sant, the Richard B. Russell Professor of History at the University of Georgia. Claudio's research interests include early American history and Native American history. He is the author of 3 books, including West of the Revolution, An Uncommon History of 1776, which invites readers to investigate the North American continent beyond the British colonies during the American Revolution. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Claudio.
Glad to be here.
So West of the Revolution tells the story of 9 different places around the North American continent during the American Revolution and War for Independence. But all of these 9 locations lay outside of the rebellious British colonies, which makes West of the Revolution a truly uncommon history of 1776. Claudio, how did you become interested in early American history beyond the 13 British American colonies?
Well, I think my interest goes way back to my childhood. I grew up on the West Coast in San Francisco, so I was always aware that early American history was much larger than the kind of traditional early American history that we receive in schools, and that even I learned on the West Coast, that is about the 13 British colonies. So I knew there was much more to it. I knew that there were Spanish people in North America, and so that's, I think, where the interest originates. But more recently, when I was an undergraduate, I studied Italian and lived in Italy. And when I applied to grad school, I actually had intended to study Renaissance history. And I ended up switching for a number of reasons. But I did want to continue to do research in a language other than English. So I learned Spanish, and I went down to Mexico when I was in graduate school, and so was working in the archives there studying the Spanish borderlands. And it was obvious to me from day one that we call this place the Spanish borderlands, but there were never more than 2,000 Spanish-speaking people in the Spanish borderlands east. Well, there were 100,000 native peoples. And that really opened up an entire world to me, right? All of North America, which was peopled by Native Americans, yet is so rarely included in early American history. And so I got into it that way.
You raise a good point. I mean, if and when we think of the early American West, we tend to think of the Spanish in Louisiana, the Southwest, and California. But West of the Revolution doesn't open with a description of Spanish America. It opens with the story of Russian America. Claudio, would you tell us a bit about what the Russians were doing in North America and when they were here?
Yes. So there was a well-developed trade in furs in Russia and in Siberia in the 17th century, and as was the story later in North America, there was the furs were the fur-bearing animals were hunted out, and so the hunters, pромышленники as they're called in Russian, kept pressing further east until they reached the shores of the Pacific Ocean. And this was in the 17th century, and then they eventually crossed the Pacific and started moving up the Aleutian Island chain in search of furs. And when they got to the Aleutians, they discovered the sea otter, which is, these are beautiful animals who have the densest, of all mammals, they have the densest fur. It is lustrous. And so they started hunting these animals, or rather forcing the Aleut peoples to hunt them. And then they brought them back and traded them to the Chinese. And this was an enormously profitable trade. So they just kept pursuing these animals all the way up the Aleutian Island chain and eventually all the way down the Pacific coast as far eventually in the early 19th century. There are reports of them hunting off the coast of Baja California.
So how and why did Russian activities in Alaska and along the North American Pacific coast affect Spanish colonization of California?
Yeah, this is fascinating because the Spanish and, in fact, all Europeans had a very hazy understanding of the geography of the Pacific coast. And this is it's difficult for us to relate to this now in the world of GPS. We know where we are at all times within 30 meters, I believe. But Europeans really didn't understand what the Pacific coast looked like. And the Spanish started receiving reports that there were Russians up somewhere on the Pacific coast. Where exactly, they didn't understand. There were rumors that there was a vast river whose mouth was on the Pacific coast, and that if whichever colonizing power took over this river, where they'd be able to ascend the river and eventually reach into the heart of Spanish America and the wealthy silver mines in Mexico. So there was just a lot of confusion about the geography, a lot of rumors about Russians somewhere in the areas. In fact, in retrospect, the rumors are somewhat comical. It's really the first Red Scare, and so the Spanish start receiving reports of Slavic-looking peoples in Baja California. There's a report of one of the most powerful Spanish ministers. He comes down with an illness and is feverish, and he hallucinates that he himself spots Russians in Mexico. So there's all of this fear and confusion and a great deal of ignorance about of the geography of the region. But all of these things come together and spur the Spanish to push up the Pacific coast to protect their holdings. And so they had at that time, in the middle of the 18th century, they had missions in Baja California, but no presence at all in the state, in what later becomes the state of California. And then finally in 1769, they established their toehold in present-day San Diego. And the same year, they established Monterey, and then in 1776, they established San Francisco.
How did the Spanish go about colonizing California? Are these toeholds the famous missions that we occasionally hear about?
They are. They're missions, and in most cases have a small fort or presidio associated with the mission. So the Spanish presence in the 18th century in terms of demography is very small. We're talking about between 100 and 150 Spanish people in all of California, yet their impact on native peoples is tremendous. And this is for two reasons. One is that they introduce old world diseases, and this is unwittingly. They don't have an understanding of viruses and bacteria at the time. But they do bring these viruses with them, and the viruses, it's a familiar story for people who know about early American history. The viruses devastate the indigenous population. But the second thing they do is upset the ecological balance in California. And we think of this area today as the land of plenty, right? Such a large percentage of our fruits and vegetables come from California today, but back then in the 18th century, it was pretty hard to make a living for indigenous people, and they didn't have a lot of surplus resources. So when the Spanish arrived and arrived with their domesticated animals, hogs and cattle, and the cattle started mucking up the rivers and eating the grasses, and the hogs started eating acorns. This was devastating for native peoples, and they ended up starving, literally. So these two things combined, the demographic pressure from the diseases and then the pressure from the loss of resources, starvation, forced or led native peoples to enter these missions.
So the Spanish don't really have a lot of people in California, and they need to figure out ways to eat, and they've brought diseases to the region. What were their relationships like with Native Americans? I imagine they would have to keep them somewhat peaceful as the Native Americans outnumbered them, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, yeah, they are vastly outnumbered. Of course, they have these technological advantages, and then they have the advantages of being of not suffering from the viruses to the same extent that native peoples are. But I would say without their domesticated animals and without these old world viruses, the Spanish would have been in trouble. I think the story would have been a lot different. So the relationships were fraught. The indigenous people along the coast were desperate and saw that the only chance for their survival was to enter these missions. And so they were not enthusiastic about being there. They were living under a regimen that was foreign to them in so many different ways. They were segregated by sexes at night if they were not married. They had to work according to a labor regimen that was established by the missionaries. They had to work in the fields to produce crops for the mission. So really transformed their lives in so many ways.
So the Spanish claimed holdings in North America that stretched from present-day California east to Florida and south to Mexico. And in June 1776, 2 Franciscan missionaries and an artist set out over the Colorado Plateau to try and connect these far-flung colonies, or at least to connect Monterey, California with Santa Fe, New Mexico. Claudia, would you tell us about this expedition? Were the Franciscans successful in finding a route for a road between Monterey and Santa Fe? And why did they take an artist with them?
This is a fascinating story. So California is, from the perspective of the Spanish, is remote, and it is extraordinarily difficult for them to communicate with this colony and to supply it. And so they have 2 options. They can go over land from Baja California, but that is really arduous and difficult journey. And then the second possibility is to sail up the coast, but they're sailing against the headwind, or into the headwinds. And that proves to be disastrous, too. They lose a number of ships, and there are stories of ships making it all the way up to Monterey from Mexico, but not being able to actually get into harbor because of the winds, and then being pushed all the way back down south. So they recognize in the 1770s that they need to figure out a better way to supply these missions and to strengthen the Spanish presence generally in this part of the Americas. So they come up with the idea of connecting Santa Fe, which is a much older and better established colony, with the Pacific coast. And the only problem is that no Spaniard knows exactly what lies between Santa Fe and the Pacific Ocean. Their maps show some fictional places, but they don't know anything about the Great Basin, this vast desert that they would have to cross. They don't even know about the Sierra Nevada mountains. So this would be an extraordinarily difficult journey to undertake, even if you knew the layout of the terrain. And you can imagine how difficult it is if you have no idea what you're going to encounter. But nonetheless, they think that this is a good idea, that it could revive the New Mexico colony, and it could also strengthen the California colony at the same time. And Franciscans are excited that they can convert Indians along the way. So in 1776, in the summer of 1776, 2 Franciscan missionaries, Dominguez and Escalante, strike out with a small party of Spaniards west from Santa Fe with the object of reaching Monterey. And as you mentioned, they take an artist with them. His name is Bernardo de Miera, and he's a cartographer. He'd been living in New Mexico for decades, so was familiar with indigenous peoples, and they took him with them in part to produce a map of their travels, and indeed he did it. Produced a beautiful map, really a work of art. It's 2 feet tall and 3 feet wide and just packed with fascinating information. But so they struck out for the west, and eventually, 6 months later, return to Santa Fe. They don't make it. They do reach the edge of the Great Basin. So this is western Utah, and then eventually turn south and end up down in Arizona, and then turn back east. And they do cross the Colorado River, the Grand Canyon, really an extraordinary story, and then return to Santa Fe.
Did they encounter any Native American peoples along the way? And if they did, what were relations like between the groups?
They did. They encountered a number of Utes and Paiutes, and in fact came to depend on them for assistance in navigating the terrain. So I went through the account of their travels, and it's quite striking during the occasions when they have no indigenous person to help them show them the way, they end up in trouble. And this is one of the most beautiful areas of North America, but it's also extraordinarily difficult to travel through. There are escarpments and ravines and deserts and mountains, and so when they don't have an indigenous guide, they end up traveling down ravines that turn out to be dead ends, and they have to backtrack, or they start ascending an escarpment, which turns out to be extraordinarily difficult. And then when they do find a native person who will agree to assist them, the road becomes a lot easier for them. So they negotiate with a number of different Utes to help them along the way. There are also some occasions where they are abandoned by their guides. And when they are abandoned, they become desperate, especially when they're down in southern Utah and Arizona, when they are desperate. This is towards the end of their 6-month expedition. And they are desperate for food and water, and they just don't know where to find either one.
And what happened when the Spanish expedition caught sight of the Grand Canyon? Was it the awe-inspiring view that we have today when most people encounter it, or was it completely different?
Yeah, the accounts don't talk about the grandeur of the geography in the area. It's really about the difficulty. And you have to remember, they've already been on the road for 5 months or so, and they want to get back home at this point. And here they are faced with this huge river and the Grand Canyon, and they have to somehow get across it with their horses and all of their equipment, and it takes them a full week. They are going up and down the river trying to figure out how they're going to descend to the riverbank with their horses. They finally find one area. They have to cut out a path for the horses so the horses can get down. They lower some of their equipment by rope, as I recall, and then they have to get across the river itself. And they do finally make it across, but it is a tremendous challenge.
So it's really an unpleasant surprise for them, too.
It is an unpleasant surprise, yes.
So from the North American Southwest and Pacific Coast, west of the Revolution turns our attention north to the activities of British and Native American fur traders around Hudson Bay in Canada. Claudio describes how British traders became reliant on local Cree peoples to acquire beaver pelts because of the extreme weather conditions in the area. Claudio, would you describe the Hudson Bay area during the mid to late 1770s for us? And how and why were British traders reliant on local Cree peoples? And while we're at it, why were Europeans obsessed with acquiring beaver pelts?
So beaver were turned into felt hats. And this is where the expression "mad as a hatter" comes from, because in the process of turning a pelt into felt, you have to use, at least in the 18th century, they used mercury, and mercury makes people mad. But the hats, felt hats, were enormously popular in Europe in the 18th century, and every self-respecting man wanted one. This was true of the English and the French and the Spanish, and in fact, other people, or even there are records of the British exporting these hats to Africa as well. So there's a huge market for the furs, and the Hudson's Bay Company is established to supply the market. It's established way back in 1670, and by the 1770s, it's an old and well-established company. But the way it operates is that they have a series of posts along the shore of Hudson Bay, forts, as they called them, York Fort and Churchill Fort, and they waited there for Cree and Assiniboine Indians to bring these furs down from the interior of Canada. Now, the climate in this part of the world astonished the British, and they wrote numerous reports, kind of pseudoscientific reports about how cold it was. Beer would freeze if you left it outside. When you wake up in the morning, there would be inches of ice frozen on the inside of your room, and you'd have to chip it off with a chisel. I remember one report, someone writing and saying it's just a dismal sight to see someone frozen like a block of ice. So it amazed them. The weather amazed them. Of course, it also killed them. It's a dangerous place to be out and about in the winter. And for that reason, they didn't have the knowledge or skills to be able to survive in this part of the world. They relied on indigenous people to do the hunting for them.
Now, if we go from Canada a little further south, you note that the Treaty of Paris 1763 marked the end of the French and Indian War, with the French, Spanish, and British dividing the North American continent along the Mississippi River. At several points in West of the Revolution, Claudio discusses this division and how it created problems for Euro-American colonists and Native Americans. Claudio, would you provide us with one or two examples of how the European division of North America along the Mississippi River proved inconvenient for the residents of North America?
Yeah, this is a fascinating story. So there are European diplomats in Paris over the course of 1762. They're negotiating the treaty that would eventually end the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, and then finally in 1763 the war formally comes to a conclusion with the Treaty of Paris. But one of the stipulations in the treaty is that the continent, North America, is to be divided down the Mississippi River, with the eastern half to go to the British, with the important exception of New Orleans, which is on the east side of the river, and the western half to go to the Spanish. So the French are to evacuate the continent. So in the abstract, or at least from the perspective of people in Paris, this seems like a good idea, but in practice it's not. This is the major artery in North America in the 18th century. And so to take the Mississippi River and say it's going to divide territory really is just not practical. For centuries it had been a major thoroughfare. There was trade up and down the river, and people were attracted to the river itself. Nonetheless, the treaty says they're going to divide the continent this way, and this has major implications for Native people. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. One is further east for the Creek Indians. So they lived in the southeast, present-day Georgia and Alabama. And previous to the treaty, they had been able to trade with the French, the Spanish, and the British, and this put them in a good position. They were trading peoples deeply engaged in transatlantic trade. Their chief commodity was the deerskin, and obviously it benefited them to have more than one trading partner. But after the treaty, once the continent was divided down the Mississippi, the Creeks found that they had only a sole trading partner, and that was the British. And so the British, this was a disadvantage economically, but also militarily as well, because the British now had this trump card. In essence, they could cut off trade whenever they wanted to, and in fact they did in the 1770s. So that's just one example. Another example is the Osage Indians who lived in present-day Missouri. And in this case, it actually benefited them because they found now that they were living on this border between the Spanish and English, and that they could make a great deal of money by smuggling goods across the river. And also they found that they could take advantage of the geopolitical situation. They could abuse the Spanish, and when the Spanish decided to cut off trade, the Osage could just go across the river and trade with the British, and vice versa. The same was true with the British. They could abuse the British and then go trade with the Spanish if they needed to. So this is an instance where it actually benefited Native peoples.
You also mentioned that another consequence of this dividing line at the Mississippi River is that it caused violence on the Great Plains. So how did the end of the French and Indian War cause Native American violence on the Great Plains?
So the British move into, we're talking about now the Old Northwest, so east of the Mississippi River for a moment. The British move into this area that formerly had been occupied by the French, and Native peoples are not happy with it. The British are imperious. They've just scored this great victory against their centuries-long enemy, the French, and they decide to lord it over indigenous peoples. They abuse them. They don't follow diplomatic protocol, traditional indigenous diplomatic protocol. They also take advantage of the trading situation. And this leads to Pontiac's rebellion in 1763, which disrupts Atlantic trade and affects lots of people, not not just native peoples living in the old Northwest, but now further west of the Mississippi River, Lakota peoples had been receiving trade goods such as guns from the East, and then found in the 1770s that the trade, late 1760s and 1770s, that the trade was interrupted. The trade was proving to be unreliable. And they turned west, and instead of trying to profit by the Atlantic trade, they decided to invest their energy and resources in hunting bison. And they pursued bison west across the Mississippi River and then across the Missouri River, and eventually sometime in the 18th century, we can't say exactly when, but by one indigenous count in 1776, the Lakota peoples discover, as they say, the Black Hills, which eventually became their sacred homeland. So it has the Treaty of Paris has all kinds of ramifications which unfold over the course of the subsequent couple of decades.
There is a lot going on in North America as the British colonists, or many of the British colonists along the 13 colonies, are fighting for their independence. The Chinese desire for furs caused the Russians to move into North America, which caused the Spanish to colonize California. The end of the French and Indian War temporarily halted violence among European peoples in North America, but gave rise to Native American violence. And the European Treaty also ended the war by dividing the North American continent in half without acknowledging the impact that the new boundary would have on Native Americans and Euro-American colonists. Claudia, were you surprised when you discovered the level of interconnectedness between the peoples and events you explored in west of the Revolution?
Well, both yes and no. I knew it. I certainly knew it in the abstract. There were a couple of examples, though, that I ran across that really did astonish me. And in fact, my favorite example, which still astonishes me when I describe it today, is the connection between the beaver trade, so through the Hudson's Bay Company in the Canadian prairies, and the Russian trade in sea otters on the Aleutian Islands. So, as I discovered, we've got these two imperial powers who are trading with indigenous peoples for New World furs, in one case beaver, in the other case sea otters. And then these furs are shipped, in one case, through Hudson Bay across the Atlantic Ocean to London, where they are put into warehouses. And then in the other case, they are shipped from the Aleutian Islands across the Bering Sea to Okhotsk into Siberia. And then from there, the sea otters are taken upriver, eventually to Lake Baikal. This is in southern Siberia. It's the largest or deepest freshwater lake in the world. And the sea otters are taken there and then taken across the lake to this tiny little town called Kyakhta, which today sits on the border between Mongolia and Russia, and you can look this up in Google Maps. So there the furs are warehoused and then traded with the Chinese. And they're sent to this little town because way back in 1727, there was a treaty between the Chinese and the Russians that said that all trade between these two empires would pass between this one town, Kyakhta, or a second town, which turned out to be even more remote and never developed any significant trade. So that's what happened to the sea otters. Now, to go back to the beaver pelts, they're in London, and as I found in the 1770s, on average, about 30,000 of those beaver pelts were then re-exported from London to St. Petersburg or north through the White Sea to Arkhangelsk, and then put on sleds and taken all the way across Russia and across Siberia, and eventually to Kyakhta, this same little dusty town on the border between what was then Russia and China, and put in the same warehouses with those sea otters, and then traded to the Chinese. So this is really an extraordinary example of global trade in the 18th century. These two New World products both originating in North America, some 4,000 miles apart, then go in opposite directions around the globe and end up in the same place in Kyaukta.
That's quite the story. Huh. Now we have just a few minutes left, which means it is time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Claudio, are you ready for the Time Warp?
I am indeed.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
And it's funny that you bring up the Russians and the beaver trade because your question involves the Russians. In your opinion, what might have happened if the Russians had not attempted to expand their fur trade into North America? Would the colonial history of North America, west and south of the 13 British colonies, have been different? And if so, how?
Well, I guess there are a couple of possibilities here. One is that the history of native peoples on the Pacific coast would have been different, and native populations would have been larger, stronger, and healthier when the United States eventually arrived later in the 19th century, with all kinds of consequences then, I think, for U.S. imperialism in the 19th century. So that's one part of the equation. The second part is that if the Russians had not arrived, I don't think the Spanish would have pushed further north from Baja California into present-day California, so we wouldn't have had the Spanish presence in California. But also in the 18th century, the British and the French were poking around in the Pacific, so it's very possible that they would have colonized the region in the 1770s or later. If they had colonized this region and established a substantial toehold, what would have happened later on? So we had the American Revolution on the eastern part of the continent, but that would have had few, if any, consequences for the imperial power, France or Britain, on the western part of the continent. Which raises some interesting questions, right? How would the United States have developed differently? What if it had encountered a substantial British or French presence on the West Coast? I don't know.
This is, wow, that's quite the answer. There are a lot of fun scenarios there that we can turn over in our brains as we think about what would have happened if the French or the British had settled California and not the Spanish. And California's history would be completely different.
Yes, it would.
So before we conclude, what is the aspect of early American history that you are researching now?
I am busy trying to map the population in North America, indigenous as well as colonial, free as well as enslaved, from 1500 to 1790, and this is really an impossible task, but I am doing it anyhow, and I hope to. I've made some headway. I've made some headway, real headway, with the British colonies. I'm working right now in the western regions, and eventually I want to put this map online. But astoundingly, we don't have such a map, so we don't really have a picture in our mind's eye of the tremendous demographic transformation that occurred on the continent between 1500 and 1790.
That sounds like both an amazing and a very ambitious project. I wish you the best of luck with it.
It is challenging.
I can't wait to see the map when it's finished. So where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
I do have my own website, claudiosant.com. I also am co-founder of ehistory.org, and I can be reached through that site. There are also a couple of online projects related to early America, which are up and running, and listeners may be interested in visiting the site.
Well, I'll be happy to include those links on the show notes page for this episode when we post it.
Great.
Well, thank you for opening our eyes to the world beyond the 13 British colonies around the time of the American Revolution. We really enjoyed this conversation.
My pleasure. This was fun.
I have to admit, Claudio's answer to the time warp question has my mind going a mile a minute. I keep thinking about what our early American past might have been like if the French or British had colonized California instead of the Spanish. And it's okay to have those thoughts, because as Claudio has detailed throughout our entire conversation, there existed a great level of interconnectivity between events in Europe and events in North America. For example, take the European decision to divide the North American continent at the Mississippi River. They made that decision in Paris, France, and yet their decision did not affect the lives of those living in Paris, France, or Europe. Instead, it greatly impacted the lives of the peoples living in North America, especially those who lived around the Mississippi River. They're the ones that felt the European border change the most. The change upended their lives. It forced some to leave their homes, some to leave their countries, and others to engage in warfare to secure new homelands and access to trade goods. You can find information about Claudio, his book, West of the Revolution, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, which you'll find at benfranklinsworld.com/014. If you enjoy this podcast, you may also enjoy the Junto Cast, a monthly podcast dedicated to exploring issues in early American history. Now, the Junto Cast is a bit different from Ben Franklin's World in that it is hosted as a roundtable discussion between Ken Owen, Michael Haddam, and Roy Rogers, historians and bloggers at the Junto, a group blog on early American history. You can find more information about the Junto Cast and the Junto blog by visiting earlyamericanists.com or by clicking the link on the show notes page for this episode. I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate and review this podcast, because your rating and your review will help us keep Ben Franklin's World visible and findable for new people. To rate and review Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history, just visit benfranklinsworld.com/iTunes or benfranklinsworld.com/Stitcher. And if you're unsure about how to leave a rating and review, no worries. Check out benfranklinsworld.com/reviews for helpful step-by-step instructions. And finally, if you were a North American colonist, which colony, or continental location I should say, would you live in and why? Please share your answers with me on Twitter @LizCovart or via email liz@benfranklinsworld.com.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.